Forward to the Okay, great. So hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Abby, and I'm so thrilled to welcome you tonight to another excellent virtual event at McNally Jackson. Although we've resumed hosting events in store, we love keeping our Zoom events going too, in part because they give us the opportunity to bring writers from around the world into our McNally Jackson community and into your homes. 100 years ago today, on James Joyce's birthday, Ulysses was published. Tonight, we are thrilled to be celebrating the anniversary of this singular work of modernist fiction with experts Bob Seidman and Sarah Cole. More than ever, we at McNally Jackson need your support. So if you enjoy free events like this and want us to keep hosting more of them, please buy books from us. Throughout the evening, I'll post links in the chat to buy Ulysses Annotated from McNally Jackson. If you go to mcnallyjackson.com and look at our events calendar, you'll see all the amazing writers and programs that we're hosting on Zoom and in store in the coming weeks. Please keep an eye on the site or subscribe to our newsletter to hear more about what's coming soon. And now, I'd like to welcome our guests. Bob Seidman is the author of several books, including Ulysses Annotated, which he co-wrote. His film credits include Lush Life, Billy Strayhorn, a documentary that won the Writers Guild Award for Best Documentary Script, a George Foster Peabody Award, and an Emmy. He lives in New York City. Sarah Cole is Parr Professor of English and Comparative Literature and Dean of Humanities at University. A specialist in literary modernism, she is the co-founder of the New York, New Jersey Modernism Seminar and director of the Humanities War and Peace Initiative and the Climate Humanities Initiative at Columbia. She is the author of 3 books, Inventing Tomorrow, H.G. Wells and the 20th Century, Columbia, 2019. At the Violet Hour, Modernism and Violence in England and Ireland, Oxford Modernist Literature and Culture Series, 2012. And Modernism, Male Friendship and the First World War, Cambridge, 2003. She has also published articles in journals such as PMLA, Modernism, Modernity, Modernist Cultures, Modern Fiction Studies, and ELH, and in edited collections. She was the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship. One final note, there will be time at the end of tonight's conversation for your questions, so start thinking about them now. You can put your questions in the Zoom chat, and we will get to them towards the end of the evening. Since you can't join me in a round of applause, I'll just say one last time that we are very pleased to welcome Bob and Sarah. Take it away.
Thank you. Maybe I'll start just again, thanking you all for being here virtually, and just to reiterate that you can put questions into the chat at any time, and at around 7:30 or so, we'll shift over and hopefully we can make this a discussion. We'll read them. If some of you want to speak your questions out loud, the group is small enough that we should be able to do that, and we'd love to have a dialogue with you. So I'll just start by saying I am honored and thrilled to be here on this amazing day with Bob Seidman, who really, aside from Joyce himself, has probably contributed most, along with his former co-editor, his late co-editor, Don Gifford, to bringing Ulysses to all of us. I teach Ulysses a lot. I always require the students buy and use Ulysses Annotated, and they do, and they depend on it. So it's wonderful to be here today. And let me just say as a start that for me, I'm an administrator now. I've got kids to keep me busy. I'm teaching, not Ulysses this term, but just spending the last 24 hours or so thinking about this amazing anniversary, rereading Ulysses, thinking about Ulysses. It's just felt like a total joy. And not everything in life brings us just total joy, but thinking about 100 years of this book does. So I just wanted to share that at the beginning. And I thought I would just start by essentially asking Bob a question, and maybe we can talk together about it as a beginning, which is to say, so here we are 100 years later. It's hard to believe, 1922, 2022. And I guess I wanted to ask Bob with me and maybe with all of you to think about, what was radical about Ulysses 100 years ago and what is still radical about Ulysses now? What was exciting about Ulysses 100 years ago and what is still exciting now? What was challenging about Ulysses and what is still challenging? So a kind of thinking about that 100 years in terms of some of its qualities, maybe that would be a good way to start.
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's great to be with you. I see some old friends out there and I can't go off the screen to see who else is watching, but hello to everybody. I think that Joyce invents and creates a way of thinking about the mind moving in a totally radical and totally unprecedented way. And I've thought for years about who were his influences. I have such a hard time coming up with anything except for Flaubert and Madame Bovary, which is clearly his way into the female mind, but not just the female mind, also the eroticism of the Catholic Church, which is at the beginning of Madame Bovary. Emma's in a convent school, and she gets very turned on by the music and the incense in the church, and this incredible kind of synesthesia in this experience. And very early in Leopold's Bloom's travels through Dublin, he enters a church to kind of take a breather, and he thinks about great place to pick up a girl. So he's so mobile, Joyce, and he understands the way the mind moves, that the mind is not a forward moving mechanism, but it loops and it retracts and it doubles back on itself. And he just does wonderful things with the way in which people perceive and the way they perceive their virtues and the way they lie about their faults. It's such a human book. And one of the problems with the hurdles it raises, Sarah and everyone else, is that some people are afraid to wade into this very complex world. But the world that Joyce is trying to portray is incredibly complex. We're very complex human beings. We're very complicated organisms, and we have many, many diverse and conflicting desires and thoughts. And this laying out of the ways in which minds move, three principal minds, but a lot of other minds as well, is quite wonderful and quite beautiful and quite a privileged experience. Sarah spent the day thinking about and dipping into Ulysses, and once again returned to this kind of incredible panoply of thought and emotion and sexuality and the rigorous thought with Aristotle. I could go on. I said to Sarah when we talked on the phone the first time that I could do a Fidel Castro about it. So let me just shut up for a minute and let Sarah. One other thing about the synesthesia and the ways in which Joyce provides us with an enormous canvas. Music, there are 256 references in Ulysses to music, from sacred music to really pretty raunchy ditties. And what it does, apart from providing a literate Dubliner in 1922 and afterwards with a soundtrack, everybody could read it in the period could hear the music of the time. Not all of the music, but you could certainly hear Mozart, you could certainly hear Thomas More's stupid ditties. So there's a kind of, and sentimental ditties, and Joyce is he's a great unsentimental writer. In fact, he quotes George Meredith saying, and from Richard Feverell, the sentimentalist is he who would enjoy without incurring the immense debtorship of the thing done. You ride along emotionally on something without really investing yourself in it. All this is in this wonderful ball that he's put into the air, this wonderful soap bubble, which of course has lasted 100 years.
Yeah, I love that. And I think, bringing up music is it's such a good way to think together about some of what makes this book special and different and challenging, but also available and open to the modern world. I mean, when I taught Ulysses, I can't remember which time it was, but a few years back, I realized that this novel was made for the digital age. It is a book that one of its many characteristics is that it always reaches out beyond itself. Right from the beginning, its title promises you that not only is it going to be a rewriting of the Odyssey, but it's going to do it via, it's called Ulysses, not Odysseus. It's already taking account of the journey that the Homeric text makes through Latinate, English traditions and into our world. And in every way, with Hamlet or Don Giovanni or all these works, these songs that are outside of the text and inside of the text. I mean, right from the beginning, as many of you know, from the moment of its book publication, he began writing these schemas, seeming to recognize at the outset that it needed an infrastructure. I think of it as a library. There is a very difficult, one of the most difficult chapters, I think, is in the library, in the National Library. And there is this sense that it needs a library, it is a library, but it's very literate. But one of the genres that wafts through it so beautifully and powerfully is music, as you say. And one of the things that's so great now for readers, for students, is that they can go to jamesjoycemusic.com or whatever it is, click it, and hear these songs. And you feel that this is not making things somehow worse, but better. That it's in the spirit of this hungry book, this book that wants to take in things, but also wants to recognize that it doesn't need to own everything, that things can kind of drift outside of itself, and that you can go and listen to the music. You might know the music, but it's really important for readers to understand that even though a lot of what we have to go back and kind of learn are the details of the day, that any given reader will only know a tiny portion of what's being referred to at any given moment. So it isn't as though somehow if we could just be standing on a street in Dublin on this day, that we would recognize everything. It's always already insufficient. And that's partly what makes it so joyful, is that there are threads everywhere and you can pull the ones that interest you. So yeah, I agree about the music, the soundtrack, all these. And then there is one chapter, Sirens, as we know, which is the kind of official music chapter, which is kind of turning into song or beginning a song and includes songs, but also is itself a kind of a form of music. And those songs, come in different varieties, but that sense, one of Bloom's many, many wonderful qualities, he has some limitations, is his susceptibility to hearing music everywhere. There's music in everything, or in Aeolus, the newspaper chapter, he thinks everything speaks in its own voice. So he has this kind of aural, with an A, quality, which is something that, of course, Joyce had as coming from a great musical family and himself a musical person.
Bloom tells Molly to pitch her voice into the corner of a church so that it will come back and shower and he knows music backwards and forwards, as Sarah suggests. There are other reasons for music being there, apart from Joyce's wonderful tenor voice. There's a great story about him told to me by Peter Hassinger, who's watching and listening now, about Joyce being in Normandy just before the German invasion, when they'd had to commit their poor daughter to an insane asylum. And there was a dinner going on, a lot of French soldiers waiting for the invasion, and they started to sing the French national anthem, and Joyce joined in, and some people were turning to his amazing voice. They lifted him up, put him on a table, and had him lead it when they sang it again. But music also breaks down this division, this phony division between high culture and low culture. It's really very important. And it's also visceral, as Sarah suggests. It's sexy. They're wonderful love songs. It's so alive. And it's also very difficult to forget a good song. Those damn 50 songs that recycle an hour. I'm talking to a couple of my old friends. Heads, you can't get rid of How Much Is a Doggy in the Window, which is probably the worst song ever written. But Joyce also puts in some of the worst songs ever written because he loves the spectrum of what's available to us as human beings. One of the reasons this book doesn't die, Sarah and everyone, is because its spectrum is so enormous and it's so humane. It's so careful about people's interactions. Both Molly and Bloom realized toward the end of the book that both of them are responsibility for some of the failures of the marriage. And maybe held out, this is the life beyond the page that Sarah was suggesting, maybe there's a chance of some kind of reconciliation. You know, you can't bet on it. I certainly wouldn't put my money on it, but it's possible that Molly and Bloom will be reunited physically. I certainly hope so. The other thing, let me just go on, Sarah, before you jump in again. And I love what you said. Joyce is not a lazy writer. I was just thinking about the way chapter 4, the first time he met Bloom and then Molly a little later, he drops in a little thing about watching the cat. The cat does not meow. It says MKGNAO, McMow, I guess. And then the second time it speaks, it says that with an R introduced, MRKGNAOIOA. It's extraordinary. Think about that. Every other writer in the world wouldn't have thought of it at that point in 1922. Later, people began to understand that, in fact, you really have to listen carefully. You can't just take conventional attitudes by this. One of the reasons Ulysses is so difficult is that it's always pushing the limits. And he's eliminated, like all of the modernists, Sarah and I were thinking about this too, the narrator is gone for the most part, although every once in a while the narrator crops up with a little, you know, get over there. Let me show you what I want you to look at next. But think about Dickens, for instance, with the endlessly, and I love Dickens, he's a great writer, endlessly intruding narrator. None of that there. You have much less of a net, as you do with Eliot and the Wasteland. How you know the absurdly short footnote list, which, you know, only scratches the surface. So you're sort of thrown into a wonderful briar patch, and you have to figure your way out of it if you want to read the book.
Yeah, I mean, I think the relationship between just excess and detail and manyness and just the kind of encyclopedic quality, and then the experience of landing on these kind of simple truths, these beautiful moments. I mean, you think of something like Circe, which is half the book in length. It's just this unbelievably wild phantasmagorica. And, you know, at the end, there's Rudy as a kind of fairy child. Right. And there's been all these problematic anti-Semitic images of men. And I've thought a lot about those. Is this Bloom internalizing it? Is this actually Joyce's to the books in anti-Semitism? Is this the kind of the collective unconscious of this world, which I think is probably the most likely answer. But then there's Rudy. And there is, with Molly and Bloom and this long day of worrying about adultery and of it happening and of other adulterers. Stephen calls Nelson a one-armed adulterer, and there are many others in history. And of course, Odysseus is shadowed in his trip home to Ithaca, to his faithful wife Penelope, by the story of Agamemnon and Clytemnestra, who was not faithful, obviously, and among other problems with Agamemnon's return. And so these kind of foils of the adulterous wife, dog the whole story, both of Odysseus and of Bloom. And yet, he comes home and he thinks, okay, it isn't going to be a revenge drama. It isn't going to be about that, although he kind of holds it in the back of his mind. Maybe I'll get back at him later. But there's a sense in which this is a marriage which hasn't been fully consummated in 10 years, where there's a lost child, where there's a lot that needs to be figured out and fixed and lived with. And so there's something so kind of satisfying about that sense of imperfection and incompleteness as being okay. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think you're at the heart of the reason the novel is so great to me, and I think that Sarah and to, several people I know are on watching, is that it really is about a grown-up set of questions, that it really says, all right, man, are you going to come home, or are you going to create murder and mayhem? He thinks about it. Bloom thinks about it because he isn't a violent man, but it's a possibility. And then he thinks, no, I'll go home and I'll work on it. I'm going to ask her to do something to get off of her butt for a change and serve me breakfast in bed tomorrow, which I did on June 16th, 1904. And she's very critical about it. At the same time, she's just had very satisfying athletic sex with her lover. At the same time, she says, not sure that Polly doesn't have more spunk in him. I mean,
he's a better man in some
he's
way.
a better man. And this ass, excuse me, the worst man in Dublin, as Bloom calls him, slaps Molly on her butt at the end of this event. And it's like, what? I'm in bed with a lion, she says. What is this about? She needs something more than boiling. She has not had sex, as Sarah said, for 10 years, 5 months, and 18 days, something like that. Why? Because that child that Sarah so cleverly mentioned, Rudy, dies at the age of 11 days. And according to Orthodox Jewish law, you must reproduce yourself, have both a male and a female heir. Bloom has exiled himself from the bed sexually. They play around, they fiddle around occasionally, but he's exiled himself because he doesn't think and in fact, he says it quite explicitly later. If the child dies, the male is weak. Basically, I can't remember the phrase, but he takes on a burden which is totally unnecessary for a non-observant Jew. It is the most complex ball of wax that I know of in fiction. Here's a guy who is perceived by everyone as a Jew, who says quite overtly in the 17th chapter, in the penultimate chapter, no, of course I'm not Jewish because my mother isn't Jewish and her mother wasn't Jewish. But nonetheless, he takes on these strictures out of nowhere, except that his father was, of course, an Orthodox Jew, and I guess he feels an obligation to virag about this stuff. It's not at all clear. Like all of us with motivation, why do we do certain things? We have explanations for them, but they aren't always accurate, or they're only partial. Please, Sarah.
Yeah, and I think Bloom, I mean, trying to go back to some initial questions, like what makes this book exciting and radical still? And there are a lot of answers to that. One is about Bloom as the protagonist, someone who is, as many people have thought about and written about, a surprising person to have as your epic, hero or your redeemer of the nation or anything else. But I think that his identification with his Jewishness is so perfect for this moment, for this world that Joyce is thinking about. It's an affiliation. He knows he's not technically Jewish. He doesn't practice Jewish. He's been converted at least once. Like, he's not a Jew in any actual sense, but he is a Jew, and he sees himself that way. And he has all of these different kinds of fantasies about, or sort of thoughts in his thought sequences about different aspects of Jewish life, including these kind of happy memories of early days with these Jewish families. And then there's all of this kind of thinking about the Holy Land, and should he have shares in a farm there? And then there's some and some of that gets kind of orientalized in different ways. But then he has that amazing vision early on in the first chapter when he's coming back from the butcher and he thinks about the Holy Land, and suddenly the cloud comes over the sun. It's so interesting, by the way the sort of meteorological have these kind of qualities to them, these sort of affective qualities. So the sun goes over the sky and suddenly he has this dark vision. And he thinks of it as a kind of sunken cunt of the world. And then suddenly, yes, and then he remembers Molly's warm body, and the sun comes back out and he rushes home and he's happy again. So these mood swings. But that sense of Judaism or Jewishness, or a kind of the wanderingness and the desire to come home, these are very basic. They are particularized, but they're also generalized. And the only other thing I want to say about that is that, one of the things you mentioned, the cat, wonder, W-O-N-D-E-R, is one of the verbs. That is Bloom's verb. He is a wanderer. Wonder why this, wonder if. That's what he does all the time. It's one of his
and he's also
qualities.
And he's also
a wanderer.
Jew,
Yes. He's a wandering, and those things, and this sense of the novel kind of creating a parallel between Ireland and Palestine, or a kind of Jewish homeland and an Irish home, home rule, home country. Those things are kind of shadowing each other or playing off each other. And so Bloom's identifications, that's part of what we follow. You know, he's such an outsider through so much of the day, but then he'll have these moments of kind of recognizing something or stating something as a kind of, you know, self-assertion of who he is or what he believes. A country is a place of people living together in the same place or in different places.
A wonderful definition. Oh,
It's the best.
it's absolutely wonderful. There, you know,
Can I ask you something?
Yeah,
Do you
sure,
still feel that this is a radical? I mean, like if I go to the MoMA,
Yeah.
the Museum of Modern Art, I do with my kids all the time, they're not particularly surprised by what they see. It doesn't feel radical to them.
Right.
Whereas when they see me reading this book, I'll say, here, I'm going to read you some. And they say, my son says, what is that? You know, do you feel like there's a way in which this book has somehow not become familiar or domesticated in the way some aspects of the modern movement have?
Yes, I think it's a great point. I think he knew he was sort of defending himself against oversimplifications, and he wanted to make it hard in many, many ways. And he did. The erudition, the amazing historical viewpoint, the knocks on the Catholic Church and its capitulation to Britain, the lures and the lore and the absolutely mind-fucking British colonialism, the ways in which this massive tome surrounds itself with its all sets of an insoluble problem, which of course is our fate as human beings. There's another element, and there's so many places Sarah and I want to go in this. Time is the most bizarrely manipulated element. And of course, time speeds up. We all know this, you know, even someone as dumb as I know, it speeds up and it slows down depending on what's going on. Well, every chapter is supposed to be an hour, right? Except for Molly, who's sort of off the clock because she's in another world. Molly's time is like 2 to 4 or something like that a.m. But the chapter that Sarah mentioned, the Nighttown, the Associated chapter, is 149 pages in the relatively new Random House book. Nothing else, of course, approaches that. It's set up like a play, but still, it's a massive thing. And the book starts at 8 a.m. with Stephen, Buck, and Haynes in the tower, and it begins over again at 8 a.m. in chapter 4. So this is a kind of incredibly elusive concept, and it seems to me modernism, and I know you know a great deal about this, addresses time in ways that the 19th century did not. There's a self-consciousness about it. And we haven't even really talked about sexuality, but not just sexuality, also the physical being. Every character, with the exception of Stephen, who doesn't really like his body and knows very little about his body, and the suffering from bad teeth, should he spend his money from the gig. He already owes all of Dublin 21 pounds, which is more money than he can make in 6 months if he stays at the school, but we guess he's leaving the school. Anyhow, everybody does things. They fart, they go to the bathroom, they take pee. Guy takes a pee in the citizen, in the bar, it clearly has syphilis. It hurts him when he pees. You know, twice he goes, ouch, when he's peeing. So, you know, there's a body there. And that's one of the reasons that it was so hard for it to become accepted. Why so many of the authorities said this is a bad book, but it's a good and a bad book. It's bad because it will not do things conventionally. It's a naughty book. It really, and it's quite self-conscious. It's very self-conscious. He says, you know, I put so many enigmas and puzzles in it that professors will be spending the rest of their lives wondering about this. Of course, Gifford and Seidman,
we are.
Some of that. And that's the only way to ensure immortality. Of course, that's the joke line. The only way to ensure immortality is to write a great book. And you're not even sure if it's going to work when you write a great book.
No, but you're so right about the body. I mean, it's such an embodied book. And, you know, I was just the other day, I was teaching some of Virginia Woolf's famous essays about that sort of defined what she saw as their modern movement. And Ulysses is in the process of being written at the time, at the first one, the second one, it was done. And she's very, of course, interested in Joyce and sees him as all of them did, as a kind of, pure hero of a certain modern sensibility and integrity. But she also is bothered by the indecency. She doesn't like it. And she talks about how she sees this as sort of like the sound, as she describes it, of breaking and crashing, that Joyce she sees all this emphasis on, on shitting and pissing and sex and everything as being his kind of breaking out of the constraints, the literary constraints, the cultural constraints, the religious constraints that had bound him and bind their culture still. So she finds that, she kind of wants him to get past that. I think most of us probably disagree with Woolf on that. I don't disagree with Woolf on too many things, but I do on that.
I certainly do. I think he's offended by its roughness, not just the sexuality, that there's a kind of, Woolf is a great writer, but she writes in a much more narrow spectrum from my point of view than Joyce does. She's too genteel, excuse me, to go there, I think. But maybe I'm wrong about it. She's also a little condescending to him in one comment that I read, it's like a ruffian or something like that. But
often condescending to people.
But they're both after a kind of dive into consciousness. They both share that real interest in how the mind works and how the perception. Woolf is great about perception. I love that fruit bowl scene into the lighthouse where the hand comes out. No, don't break that symmetry. Don't break up the still life there. How dare you? Take that pear away. And then, of course, the pear goes away. And that always, go ahead. I'm sorry, sir.
No, I was just going to say, they're very different, obviously very different kinds of writers. I mean, I think that just thinking about what, constitutes, a book like this, there's a kind of, you were talking about sensory perception, which is such an important part of the book. But what's interesting there, and Woolf really keeps to that. A book like To the Lighthouse or Mrs. Dalloway is very kind of pure about that. Actually, it still does have free and direct discourse, as does this one, by the way. There are plenty, especially the first 3 chapters. Proteus, by then you're kind of in Stephen's mind, but it's what's so radical, I think, about this book is that actually it doesn't do that all the time. And after, starting with Aeolus, as we know, it just starts doing different things in every chapter, and you suddenly have different narrators in the Citizen chapter in Cyclops, or again in Eumaeus, you have an unknown narrator. You have this sort of, people have thought about the kind of author figure differently as a kind of a ranger or a consciousness or Joyce or something, but this being that is actually very much in charge and organizing chapters according to different structures or different, this one's going to be half in the words of a Harlequin romance, and this one is going to be parodying nationalism, and this one's going to suddenly leave Bloom and Stephen, and they're just wandering rocks, which, by the way, as we all know, is not an episode in the Odyssey. The Odyssey, that's the route that Odysseus chooses not to take. He chooses Scylla and Charybdis instead. And so then Joyce gives it a chapter. So it has a kind of freedom, even from its own very free, structure, and he can kind of do what he wants with it. And one thing he does is to submerge Bloom and Stephen into everybody else. So they all have a kind of equal place. So there's a way in which the insistence on being in the human mind isn't enough for him.
No, absolutely.
The versions are very different in each chapter.
Yeah. Abby, you have some. You went in and shut us up. I know.
Questions?
Ready for questions? You just let me say that this has been a wonderful experience for me, Sarah, and thank you very much, Abby, and everyone else who's on. We really could literally go on for 3 or 4 more hours. I know we're not allowed to, but we could.
Let me tell you one thing I say to my kids. My students, when I'm teaching this, we get all the way to Eumaeus, and Stephen, we learn, hasn't eaten all day. We haven't been tracking Stephen's movements all day the way we have with Bloom. We know everything he ate, everything he did, but we don't. So it's very shocking. So, I said to my students once, because we read Ulysses over the course of 2 months, I said, think of everything you've eaten. Since you began reading this book, because it does get at this issue of sort of mimetic time, that actually this day it's not translatable to the reading experience. The reading experience is exceedingly slow and protracted and immersive, and you need to have all these external texts that we were in, works that we were talking about. So there is there's a play there, there's a kind of fiction there that this is happening in a day, but a reality for readers that this is happening over months or a lifetime, maybe for.
Absolutely, there's no question. And this question of time is exactly a really lovely way to sum up that issue. I really think he's constantly aware that he's playing with the length of a day. Apart from internally, this is a lifetime undertaking if you really get serious about it. If you're really going to hang with me. I just have. There's something else that I really wanted to tell you guys or say to you guys. The lack of sentimentality. Anyhow, we can go on. You want us to take some questions, Abby? We'd love to do it.
Well, I see that Robert Ross has written, I wonder about Bloom Ulysses, not Odysseus, as the hero who comes from a defeated people in the East, Troy, and eventually triumphs. Very interesting. I mean, the question of defeat and victory and sort of triumph versus some other way of thinking about accomplishment is one that the novel works out all the way along. It's very suspicious of victors. We get that right at the beginning in the history chapter when Stephen is dealing with his boss, Mr. Daisy, who I think of as kind of one of the villains of the novel for lots of reasons. One is that he has a unitary view of history, whereas the novel is all about plurality. But Stephen is thinking about Pyrrhus and how this is the victory that brings ultimate defeat. And then there are so many. Stephen's mind, of course, is just full of different kinds of people's pretenders and heretics and those who are kind of cast out from history. So I think that, I love that question, and I would need to think more about that. I mean, you think of something like the Aeneid, which also makes its way in here at different points, particularly in the underworld sequence, where Aeneas really is that figure, the refugee from Troy. So he hates Odysseus, like they're kind of rivals. And I think there are a lot of alternate readings of the mythic or Greek or epic structure that would and should stress a different kind of heroic figure. And even if I think Joyce really kind of loves the Odyssean figure for some of his qualities, the resourcefulness and craftiness and all of that, and his love of adventure and the way he kind of keeps getting sidetracked from his own, journey home. I think you're right that I read this novel, I'll just cards on the table, as a profoundly pacifist novel. And I could talk more about what I mean by that, but I think Joyce has really had it with war and violence and triumph and empire, and he's looking for something different. And so it's important that it's the Odyssey, not the Iliad. It's the return home. It's the kind of wreckage from war, the deep, profound desire for peace, for rest, for homecoming, for the beautiful wife, not the war trophy. So I think there's a lot about that sense of the kind of affinity with such figures that really resonates for me. Bob, I think you have a question here. Could you tell us how the process of working on Ulysses Annotated changed or shaped your relationship with the novel?
Oh my, I just think Sarah said, Rob Ross's question was a great question. As you said, we could take a couple of years to figure it out. There is not an answer. Giff was a wonderful guy, and several people who were listening in were students of his, including Robert Ross. The first thing that he asked me to look at when we started the research was the 9th chapter, the chapter that's set in the National Library, in which Stephen propounds his cockamamie theory about Shakespeare being identifying with Hamlet, Senior Hamlet the king, and not with Hamlet, Junior Hamlet the prince. But what he did was ask me to look at the 3 major sources for Stephen's riff about Hamlet. One was a wonderful Danish critic called Georg Brandes, who had written a really fine book about Shakespeare. The second was a guy whose initial name was Simon Lazarus, and his tutor at Balliol College told him, "Hey guy, change it to Simon Lee. It's too Jewish a name." So the first 2 sources were Jewish commentators on Shakespeare. The third was that poser Frank Harris, who wrote a dreadful book about, Frank Harris, the kind of bad pornographer, as opposed to Joyce, who's a very good pornographer, because it is not simply about a physical act. Joyce is constantly talking about the psychology of sex. It's just one of his, talk about why it's modern. It's one of his breakthroughs. I think it's quite extraordinary. And when you think about Circe, when you think about Nighttown, what you see is a kind of reenactment of every sexual fantasy, not every sexual, but it covers masochism, it covers sadism, and it covers, believe it or not, transgender stuff. I mean, he becomes a woman. He becomes a woman for a lot of reasons, and one of which is to understand something about the ways in which women are mistreated by a bozo like Boylan, the would-be lover, the lover. It's terribly important that he run the spectrum by us for his point of view, because it's a sort of variant on the Renaissance Blazon when the courtier describes his mistress's beauties, her nose, her breasts, her legs, her skin. But he runs through this incredible gambit of sexuality, including class issues. I'm a working class guy, and who are these extraordinarily beautiful women dressed up to the nines who get into their carriages and show a little leg? It's this incredible exploration. That's why we're not tired of it, Sarah and all.
Yeah, I mean, that it is true that the sort of polymorphous sexuality of, that Freud and others thought about goes quite wild here, the new womanly man. And, some of it is, I don't know how seriously it's taken, but it's here. I mean, I often think about Circe in terms of, one of the questions you can kind of ask yourself as you're moving through Ulysses is, where does it come from and where does it go? And one of the things that Circe does is to kind of bring everything back. Everything is back, from a semicolon in some chapter to major important figures to objects. That's another thing that is so interesting in this book, is the life of objects. And we started talking about music, but just things, the thingness of the novel is really extraordinary. And there are some places where that is very moving, like when Bloom comes home and his house has been rearranged, but it's still, his house. So these kind of frenzied objects that are speaking to you. But there is that feeling in Circe, and maybe this is a broader thing we want to say about the novel, that nothing begins. There's no beginning, and there's definitely no end. Absolutely. I mean, there's an end to the novel, and it's extremely satisfying. And you couldn't think that there could be a next chapter of Ulysses. So in that sense, the formal shape is so great. But there will be, a June 17th, as there was a June 15th. And there is that sense that this kind of panoply of human desires and fantasies and memories and fears and loves and joys and physical experiences, is ongoing and has always been ongoing. And so a text is always recycling an earlier tradition or an earlier novel, an earlier writer, and on within itself. I mean, it's constantly rewriting itself. There's certain refrains that come back, as with the music chapter. Oh, I see another question here.
One thing about that, just Please. Before we go on to the next question, one of the things I love about the Ulysses in Nighttown section, the chapter when they're in a whorehouse, there's no sex in the whorehouse. You talk about setting you up and then saying, hey, bozo, I got another idea about this. Sex up here. It's up here. It's not an actual physical act in the whorehouse. Anyhow, go ahead, please. Yeah.
Yeah, this is such a great question. I think about this a lot. So the question is, what is it about Joyce's writing style that signals to scholars like you that a particular word or reference in the text is worth digging into as detailed in notes? And I would love to hear your view on that, Bob. I mean, in a way, I feel like your view is everything is worth it. And, I think about this a lot. At what point, and one of the things that's so great about Ulysses is that for all of its manic cataloging energy,
yes,
it's full of mistakes. I mean, deliberate mistakes.
Oh, absolutely.
And the whole scene about the funeral, and we know this Macintosh the man in the Macintosh gets written as someone named Macintosh, and McCoy, who said, "Could you please put my name in?" He wasn't going to be there, and now he's there. And then we finally, at 570 pages later, or whatever it is, at the end, Bloom sees the actual newspaper, and his name is Miss L. Boom.
Oh, boom.
So, but there are millions of these little, I mean, not millions, but there are many of these little errors and mysteries, linguistic mysteries. Who is Macintosh anyway? Or UP, the postcard. There are a lot of, some of them have that, or the botched telegram that Steve keeps with him. And there's that weird postcard that, is obviously fraudulent in some way or other. So it not only is there the question, how do you as a reader, let's say, decide which of these things is meaningful, or maybe something's just coincidental. Like, what is a coincidence? Is there such a thing in life or in literature? But also that the text keeps setting you up in ways to remind you that not every thread can be fully unwound. Not every lead is useful or meaningful. So in a way, Rob, is that how you go? In a way, Rob, your question is one of the novel's kind of questions, or one of its forms of undercutting itself. On one hand, it seems to promise you endless enlightenment with each item. And on the other hand, it keeps saying, that item doesn't really make sense. That's just play. I mean, there's a reason why Derrida, who, as we know, invented deconstruction, said everything I've ever written is a footnote to Ulysses, that it is the parent of deconstruction, because that sense of the endlessness of play is its worldview. Yes, Bob, I'd love to hear about this.
Well, oddly enough, I have a piece coming out in something called Joyce Studies Annual this year about the verb noun verb touch, T-U-O-C-H. And it only appears in Ulysses 92 times. So anybody who did a Carol Spurgeon on this would say, well, wait a second, let's look at what he does. And of course, there's the touch in which you touch someone. There's the sexual touch. There's the touch him for a quid that Buck Mulligan says, ask Stephen to touch the English visitor for money, for a pound and a shilling, and then he gets mad at Stephen because Stephen does it. And there's so many beautiful uses. And Molly, when they conceive Rudy, one of the male bozos, and there are a lot of male bozos in the novel, says, Stephen, actually, I'm sorry, who's not really a bozo, but Stephen says, when he's very anti-paternity, he's got a father that he despises for good reason, and he doesn't want to believe he's the product of his father and his mother. And he says, no man can know the moment in which his child is conceived. Well, both Molly and Bloom agree about when they conceived this child. When Molly says, give us a touch, Poldy, I'm dying for it, which is an amazing formulation. Give us a touch, meaning let's get into bed together, Poldy, and then the gerund, I'm dying for it, which of course is the beginning of the end of the sexual relationship. A decade later, they still haven't had intercourse. I get quite emotional, about this thing, because it so brilliantly brackets the whole problem. And Bloom, from that moment of the death of Rudy, the male child at 11 days, will not have intercourse with his wife. He's hoisted by a petard that should be foreign to him, but and Molly got it right. And they she's gone to the window with the rip in her nightgown, and there's a policeman looking up at her, which clearly turns them on. So, I mean, this is not with the usual conventional sexual thing. And the poor Gertie McDowell, I think the reason that the bicyclist brother goes back and forth in front of her window is she's the teenage version or 22-year-old version of Molly that she, is trying to capture him by showing some of her attributes to him. That's conjecture, but it's certainly possible. Anyhow, talk about pushing the envelope. This is pushing the envelope. Yeah.
That's as we know, that's when they stop the presses on that chapter. I mean, there's a lot you can say about Gertie in that chapter, which I would love to do. I wanted just to comment on when you were talking about the use of the word touch. one principle of Ulysses, so we can think about all the ways it's difficult, but there are a lot of ways that it's actually, also very legible, even without, all these guidebooks, although they help a lot. And that is because each chapter teaches you how to read it, and the book teaches you how to read itself. But there are a lot of ways in which it does that. But if you look at even the very first chapter, which of course anyone would do in thinking about these things, there's a lot that in many ways the chapter is about habits of symbolic thinking and of reading, coded forms of reading, language use. But so Buck keeps using this term kip in all these different ways. He has like 6 different ways he uses it. Right. And the other K, 3-letter K word in that first chapter is key. And of course, there's an actual key, which, both Stephen and Bloom don't have their keys and is taken from him. There's a lot of symbolic resonance to that. And there's the ad with the keys and everything. But there's also this idea of a key. How do I read? What is the code? How do I break the code? And of course, the woman comes in with the milk and she's symbolic of Ireland and this, and she doesn't know what they're talking about in Gaelic, but there's a question of sort of how do we read her? What are these allegorical reading practices or these coded reading practices that nationalists undercover need? So there are a lot of ways in which the novel is very interested in helping you to understand, again, the kind of multiplicity and plethora of these meanings, but also to try to guide you in its own reading strategy. And then each chapter, based on the kind of thinking that it's doing and on its Odyssean Homeric chapter, has its own reading style, but also its own reading training or its own reading cues. It teaches you, and the nature of its metaphors, the way it's written and thought, that's all connected back to its theme. So these things are actually really very user-friendly in a certain way. You have to kind of get into the spirit of it. And the other thing you have to do, and this is something I try to do with students, I tell them right at the beginning, give up the idea of mastery. That is never going to happen.
Absolutely.
But instead, you kind of have to submit yourself to it. I mean, I think in a way that's part of why this book remains so radical, is that no matter how many times you've read it and you've learned all this stuff about modernism, and now here we are 100 years later, it's still you still have to give up something.
I couldn't agree more. I think it's beautifully put, Sarah. And there's so many aspects of that I'd like to follow up, but there's one little aside about the milk lady, the milk maid, who's not a maid, it's not a young woman anymore. Joyce hardly ever throws away a character. She's incredibly perceptive. She says to Mulligan, "Oh, you're a medical student, aren't you?" I mean, and then she does this incredible business of adding up the bill. And she says 1 and 1 are 2 and 2 are 2. I can't remember what it is, but 2 and 2 are 2, meaning 2 pounds. I mean, it's like, whoa, what kind of mathematics is that?
I love her accounting system. She's so awesome.
Exactly. Brilliant. It's so funny. It's so funny. And that's the other thing. We really haven't talked enough about its humor. It is one of the funniest books ever written. Where else would Jehovah be known as the collector of prepuces? Where else would someone say a pier is a disappointed bridge? Now, it's a great joke, but Stephen tells it to his students and they don't get it. They don't know what he's talking about. Or the weather's as changeable as a baby's bottom. Or, they're just or Bloom's play with his paper and the soap. He's like Chaplin. He's always doing these little sleight of hand things. It is so freaking funny. It's just funny. It makes me laugh. And what does laughter do? What does it do? It takes down this high seriousness of this stuff. It says, come on in, have fun, enjoy this thing.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. The funniness, the humor, the gaudiness, but also even at a kind of a larger level, like when you want to get to the end and say, okay, we've completed our epic journey. But there are other literary models like the comedy. I mean, the Dantean comedy, but other kinds too. And where, the ending is not about, I mean, if you think about it, when the Odyssey ends, everybody is slaughtered. And that is not what Joyce chooses to do. And instead there is the kind of reunions. And there are ways in which the model of comedy, both in the kind of high generic sense and in terms of this more colloquial sense, are very, very powerful here. I tend to read it a little bit, he would hate this if I say it sentimentally, which is to say, there's certain kinds of basic relationships whose power and beauty attract me as kind of one of the final types of things, but not because they are transcendent, because they're so normal and so flawed. I have there's a wonderful little poem by Wallace Stephen. It's not a poem, it's the last stanza of the Poems of Our Climate. And he writes, I love this, is to me characterizes, especially the last chapters of Ulysses, there would still remain the never resting mind, so that one would want to escape, come back to what had been so long composed. This is my favorite part of it. The imperfect is our paradise. Note that in this bitterness, the light, since the imperfect is so hot in us, lies in flawed words and stubborn sounds.
It's wonderful. I love that passage too. I was just thinking
So, Joyce,
how high the lights are darkness, and the line is, we're being there together is enough. I mean, you can't think of Stephen, you can't think of a more beautiful way of saying, oh yes, there's not much here, it's a mess, but being there together, Patty, my wife is there, is enough. It's just, it's a lot. It's a lot. Now, another thing, here's really a wild card. Don Gifford wrote this in an essay that, is somewhere in the world. I have it. The only true Christian in Dublin is Leopold Bloom. Why is that true? Because he does all of the required, there's a daily allotment of what you should do. And most of all, he has the virtue of caritas. And caritas is not congratulating yourself when you've done something good. When he goes home to recount his day to Molly, which we hear through Molly's, he tells her everything except, of course, his masturbation on the beach and his letter to Martha.
he's got a few things.
Yeah, he left out a few things, but the one that he leaves out, which is Christian Caritas, is he doesn't tell her about going to Dignam's and kicking in £5 to help out the widow while the insurance is being settled. Of course, Dignam, the drunken Irishman who dies of apoplexy or a stroke, put a lien on the insurance. He borrowed against it. So there's a whole mess to straighten out. Bloom will be one of the principles in straightening out that. Guess what? He forgets to tell his wife his true act of charity. It's so beautiful. You got almost teary. I get almost teary every time I think about it. And he's the guy who the Irish are pursuing all day long as a bad Jewish person. It's like, what are they, crazy? But Joyce meant this. He really meant that. I told Sarah this, our first conversation, when I was living in Paris in 1965. Doesn't everybody love to say something like that? When I was living in Paris in 65, I had an Irish friend, and we went to a pub and we were drinking heavily. And at one point I said, several of my friends who are listening and have heard this story, Ulysses, you're Irish, don't you love the book? And he had a mouthful of Guinness and he went, and he spit it all over the bar, not on purpose. And he said, I hate the effing book because it's so terrible. I can't stand it. I said, and I was 25 years old. I was this guy was impressive. He was an artist, blah, blah, blah. I said, what? It's one of the greatest books ever written. And he said, no, you don't understand. It makes me feel like I'm back in Dublin every time I open it up. And I've tried to get away from Dublin all of my life. So realism.
So did Joyce.
Yeah. And so did Beckett. And so did Beckett.
Replicating.
Yeah.
Wow.
Any questions, Abby? Are we?
I think we maybe, are we out of time?
I think we are out of time. And, this has been an incredible conversation, and we could really talk about Ulysses and all of these 18 chapters for ever. And I love, Sarah, that you brought up the poem and the quote about that being together is enough. And I think that this meeting of the minds has been more than enough. So I definitely want to thank Bob and thank Sarah and thank everyone who joined for your wonderful comments and questions. And please do consider, if you haven't already bought the book, Ulysses by James Joyce, Ulysses Annotated by Bob and his co-writers, and any other James Joyce novels and books that you would like to read. So,
Abby, can
yeah.
I ask one other thing? If anyone
course.
has a question that hasn't been answered, I'll be very glad to respond to them in time, you know, so.
Great.
You can get my email through Abby. Those of you who aren't my buddies or you know, friends.
Sure.
Thank you
Thank you
So
all for coming. Happy,
if there are any
Happy
I was
centennial.
just gonna,
to everyone.
yes, happy centennial. If there are any questions, you can email info@mcnallyjackson.com. And then we can get those questions to Bob. And also this recording will be available on YouTube. So you can watch it again at your leisure.
Great. Thanks so much, everyone. Sarah,
Hey,
it was a pleasure.
Everyone.
Great
It was great, Bob. We'll take it up on email.
Exactly. Ciao.
Okay.
Ciao.
Bye.
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 Ciao.
Have fun. How do I do this?